The ancient Greeks developed an alphabet that is still used by the Greeks today, but needless to say it's quite different to the Latin alphabet that most of us are probably more familiar with. So in this video I want to find out, well, why is the Greek alphabet so different and yet so similar to the Latin alphabet? Well, to find out about the Greek alphabet that was developed by the ancient Greeks, we first have to find out about a different people, notably the Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians came from an area around modern-day Israel and Lebanon and Syria, that kind of area on the coast of the Middle East, and these peoples moved out and traded across the Mediterranean and founded many settlements, especially in the Western Mediterranean and in North Africa, which is, for example, where you get the city of Carthage from, which became one of the prominent opponents to the Romans during the Punic Wars. Now, they were notably merchants and traders, trading in many things, most famously their Phoenician dye, which was a deep purple colour. And they came into contact with a different peoples, and this is how they spread their writing system which they had. Now, the writing system they had was known as an abjad, and an abjad is essentially an alphabet that is written where only the consonants are written. And so obviously you have vowels in their language too, otherwise it would be a horrible language if there were no vowels in it, but obviously they would then infer the vowels from the consonants that are written. However, by this stage the Phoenician language was what's known as an imperfect abjad, which is where, yes, they only made letters for the consonants, but when there was a vowel they would put some little sign or some little note to put that there would be a vowel there. So that's the start of where you got vowels. So instead of having an A in the word abjad, for example, you might just have a little apostrophe or something like that. Now, this is what the Phoenician alphabet looked like. Some shapes are slightly familiar to the ones that we have. Most of them seem really quite different, and most of them again are, and there's my point again with the O is drawn with this little apostrophe, or that was the little symbol for an apostrophe which they would put for such a vowel, as well as the one in the top there. And most of these shapes are quite straight angular shapes that you can draw fairly easily, and this was because the Phoenician language, when it came about, was being written on styluses, which is these little wax is bored into these wooden frames, and then you'd have these little wax booklets and you would write with a stylus, so a big stick in that. And that's why the language looks very angular. Now, an even more angular language, fun fact, is obviously the runic alphabets of the Futharks. And the reason this is even more angular is because this was carved into stones, so the famous rune stones, as well as into weapons. So you find it in some metal, obviously of blades and things, as well as on wood, which is why they are very angular and very straight, because they would be written in with a knife, carved in with a knife. But that's a little extension. So another great trading and exploratory people of the Mediterranean were, of course, the Greeks, and these are just some of the colonies that the Greeks had across the Mediterranean, and they obviously interacted with the Phoenicians. And lo and behold, it's from the Phoenicians that the Greeks got the idea of the alphabet, of writing things down, because for trade, it's really quite a useful thing to have. So the ancient Greeks, around 770, 750 BC, this is the time period we're talking, that we find the first fragments of the Greeks using the Phoenician alphabet. Again, we realize it's from the Phoenicians because the letter forms are incredibly similar, to write not in Phoenician anymore, but in Greek for the first time. And the first real artifact with a large inscription is known as Nestor's Cup, which is from around 750 BC. And the inscription on there looks like this when it's drawn out properly. And again, you can see that the letter forms have evolved slightly from the ones I showed before, and they continue to evolve separately until at one point you get Greek being really a separate entity to the Phoenician alphabet that it had been. The 5th century BC ancient Greek historian Herodotus has a different story for how the Greeks came about the knowledge of the alphabet. He writes that the Phoenicians who came with Cadmus, amongst whom were the Gepheriae, introduced into Greece after their settlement in the country a number of accomplishments, of which the most important was writing, an art till then, I think unknown to the Greeks. At first they, the Phoenicians, used the same characters as all the other Phoenicians, but as time went on and they changed their language, they also changed the shape of their letters. At that period, most of the Greeks in the neighbourhood were Ionians. They were taught these letters by the Phoenicians and adopted them, with a few alterations, for their own use, continuing to refer to them as the Phoenician characters, as was only right, as the Phoenicians had introduced them. He carries on to say, The Ionians also called paper skins, a survival from antiquity when paper was hard to get, and they did actually use goat and sheep skins to write on. That would be vellum. Indeed, even today, many foreign peoples use this material. So, for example, in the Anglo-Saxon and the later on when the Icelandic sagas are being written, that was what they were using. Those are the foreign peoples, although obviously that's more than a millennium into the future at this point. In the temple of Ismenium Apollo at Theba in Boeotia, I have myself seen cauldrons with inscriptions cut on them in Cadmean characters, most of them not very different from the Ionian. There are also other accounts by various other historians. Plutarch gets involved. There's one by Hyginus in which he says that the first vowels came from the Fates, who are essentially the ancient Greek version of the Norns from Old Norse mythology, who decide the fate of all things, at the start of the world, that kind of thing. The adoption of writing made things an awful lot easier for the ancient Greeks, and so it spread in a very short amount of time to many of their colonies. Now, one of these colonies was one of the Italian colonies in the region of Campania, and is called the city of Cumae. And in the city of Cumae, the alphabet is thought to have reached within about 20, maybe 25 years of its initial adoption by the Greeks from the Phoenicians in Euboea, which is the first city where it was adopted. Also, apologies for the awful Greek pronunciations throughout this video. And in the city of Cumae it was adopted, and then later on it had contact with the Italian or the Etruscan peoples further north, who then developed it for their own writing system very quickly, because obviously it was such a useful tool to have that they saw the use in it and started to write themselves, again in this now already slightly changed Western form of the archaic Greek script. Now, an interesting thing is that this would then develop into an Etruscan script, but already there were some changes in this Western Greek from the Eastern Greek, so in what's now modern-day Greece. There were already some changes in the letter forms that were then transcribed over into the Etruscan forms, and that we still keep today, as you can see from this helpful little table here, which is really quite interesting. And also the Etruscan language over the centuries started to change as well. Now, it's thought that Etruscan, that the first attested Etruscan artifact is from around 700 BC, so this is it's less than a century after the Greeks had adopted the Phoenician alphabet, and then they'd taken it over to Cumae and their western settlements, and then very soon after that it was taken over by the northern Italian peoples, the Etruscans, who spoke a non-Indo-European language, actually, very interestingly, and then used this alphabet to write their own language down. Now, of course, they came into conflict with the Romans, and after the Romans conquered them and through contact with the Etruscans and probably also the Greek city-states to the south, they then came into contact with this alphabet that was already rapidly becoming more and more like the one that we know today. And it's from them that obviously we get the Latin script, which is essentially what English is written in today, as are many languages around the world. Obviously then, what makes this so different from Greek, it does ultimately come from Greek, already it's removed several times, but after this we get a lot of evolution in the letter forms and the writing. So part of what I do for my university course is called paleography, which is the study of manuscripts, the study of writing, and there you can already see great changes within hundreds of years of each other with different scripts and writing, and some letter forms coming into use and other ones going out of use. And then it's a massive story that goes on from this point, but this is really the point where the Latin alphabet starts to develop separately. Also, of course, the Greek alphabet continued to change as well. Now, if we look at a little timeline here of the events going on, we see that from 1200 BC to basically the entire period that I'm talking about, it continued on even after the birth of Christ, I think. But we have the Phoenician alphabet, and obviously it's from the Phoenician alphabet at some point after the 9th century BC that we get the Greeks taking it over, and they then start to develop slightly differently, becoming the Greek alphabet. Now, it's very soon after this also that the Greeks move the alphabet, or the knowledge of the alphabet goes from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Western Mediterranean, and ends up in Italy, where we then get the Cumaean alphabet being written, which is, again, it's similar to the Greek alphabet, but there are some slight differences there already. Then from that, the Etruscans take it around the 7th century BC, starting to take that over there. from the Western Greek form of the alphabet, and then it's from them very soon afterwards that we get the Latin alphabet, which is what the people who would become the Romans, the great conquerors, would go on to use and to spread around the world. And as I was saying, obviously, the Greek alphabet during this time would keep developing as well in Greece, and so that would develop into the modern era. Also, obviously, of course, the Latin alphabet would be taken around the world. Things would be added, letters would be added to the alphabet to suit new languages that were being written in it. So Old English and Old Norse, for instance, had the letters of thorn and eth added in their sounds, as well as various different accents being used, like the umlaut or the grave, and accents like that being used, or the tilde in Spanish, for instance. So that continued to develop separately, which is why today they are quite different. Alright everyone, so just want to say a massive thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this one about why our alphabets are fairly different. So obviously they come from the same initial stock, and interesting enough, the runes are thought to have come from this kind of stock as well, from a Latin alphabet. If you want a more in-depth video on that, Jackson Crawford has really interesting one, so I'll link that below for you to watch. But I thought this was quite an interesting topic. It's something a bit different. It's language related, it's also related to the spread of writing and alphabets and stuff like that, which I'm really quite interested in. I'll probably make some more kind of stuff like this, but then for the kind of peoples I talk about more. So let's look at sort of the Norse peoples and how you are meant to write your language, which has its own sounds, into an alphabet that wasn't developed for that, which is why Icelandic has all sorts of fun accents and letters and stuff like that in it. But anyway, thanks very much for watching. I've been History with Hilbert, and if you could, give me a thumbs up, comment anything you want down below, continue the discussion and the knowledge, and I will see you all very soon. So, thanks for watching.